Woman's Mysteries, Ancient and Modern, by M Esther Harding. Chapter 2, The Moon as Giver of Fertility. According to the beliefs of the most primitive peoples, the moon is a kind of beneficent presence whose light is considered not only favorable but even indispensable for growth. The moon is a fertilizing force of quite general efficacy. It causes the seeds to germinate and the plants to grow, but its power does not end there, for without its aid, animals could not bear young and women could not have children. In a temperate climate, the sun's power is thought of as causing things to grow, but in hot countries, the sun seems hostile to life, scorching the young green things and destroying them. To those primitive peoples who live in southern climates, the sun appears as a force hostile to vegetation and reproduction. To them, the moon is the fertilizing power. But strangely enough, the belief that the power of growth resides in the moon is not confined to hot climates, as we shall see. The people of Greenland, for instance, hold the same views. To these peoples, it is not that the moon represents or is an emblem of the power of fertility. That is an altogether modern concept. We know, for instance, that the germ of life is in the seed, and the warmth of the sun does but foster that germ. But to the primitive, the seed is an inert mass, like a stone, entirely lacking in any power to grow. To him, that power has to be bestowed on the seed by a fertilizing force, or perhaps by a deity of fertility. When he speaks of the moon as possessing and bestowing the power of fertility, he means exactly that. It is no facon de parure for him. Plants and seeds would not grow without the influence of the moon. Animals and women cannot bear young without the energizing power of the moon. The welfare of a small tribe depends first on its numbers and second on its food supply. The number of babies born into the tribe is a matter of great tribal importance. The population can be, and generally is, prevented from increasing too rapidly in relation to the food supply by direct action. Primitive people are, as a rule, entirely cold-blooded about disposing of unwanted infants, and usually have some quite efficient, if not altogether harmless, method of procuring abortion. But control in the opposite direction is beyond man's power. An influence stronger than any he possesses has to intervene to increase the numbers of the tribe or to increase the yield of the cleared lands. As we have seen, it is almost universally felt by primitive peoples that this power resides in the moon. It is not surprising, therefore, to find that a worship or placation of the moon as giver of fertility and as guardian of the food supply is to be found in tribes who have as yet hardly any ordered or organized religion. It is recorded that tribes who seem to take no account of the sun, certainly not worshipping it, do worship the moon as a great deity. Tyler, in his Primitive Culture, reports that the primitives of Brazil, who are in a very rude state of savagery, worship and respect the moon, and that the Botocudos are said to give the highest rank among the heavenly bodies to the moon. An old account of the Caribs describes them as esteeming the moon more than the sun. In tribes who have advanced in culture beyond these rude savages, religious ideas become clearer and more definite. The Ots and the Greenlanders, who are, however, still very primitive, believe that the moon is even able to impregnate women. For this reason, their women will not look at the moon and will not sleep on their backs without first rubbing spittle on their stomachs to prevent them swelling. That is, to prevent themselves becoming pregnant by the moon. The Nigerians also believe that no husband is needed for procreation, as the women become pregnant by the moon. In this case, however, the moon does not impregnate the woman directly, as they believe. The great moon mother, who sits above in the sky, sends the moonbird to earth to bring babies to the women who want them. This idea is not unlike our own myth of the stork. The Buryats of Western Mongolia also believe that the moon may be the cause of a woman's pregnancy, without the intervention of a man. E. Best, in an article on the lore of the Werkohonga, states that the Maori believe that the moon is the permanent husband of all women. To them, the marriage of man and woman is of no particular account, because the true husband is the moon. As evidence for this conviction, they state that women menstruate when the new moon appears. Many other peoples have similar beliefs, for primitive people are by no means all convinced that the man plays any very important part in reproduction. Some think that his function is merely to rupture the hymen or to dilate the passage so as to open a way for the moonbeam to enter, for the moon is the real fertilizing agent. Other tribes do not even make as close a connection as this. They think that the moon alone and unaided can get a woman with child. Other people think that, while the most usual way for a woman to become pregnant is now through intercourse, yet this was not the case in earlier times. Then the moon alone had its power, and even today, they say, certain babies are begotten by the moon, not by any mortal father. Such children are usually royal babies or are marked out for some great destiny, as befits their celestial parentage. To the people who hold these beliefs, it follows that as pregnancy does not depend on any human act of intercourse, the woman herself is in no way responsible. If she becomes pregnant, it is the moon's doing and has no relation to sexuality. In tribes as primitive as these we are considering, there is usually no restriction on sexual intercourse before marriage, so that the connection between pregnancy and any particular act of intercourse is naturally not realized. And as the duration of pregnancy is not known until a much higher stage of culture has been reached, the failure to connect the two is not so surprising as it seems at first sight. In most primitive tribes, it is believed that the moon not only causes the pregnancy, but also watches over the birth of the child. When a woman is about to give birth to a baby, she calls to the moon for help. Often the chief duty of the midwife is to make suitable prayers and offerings to the moon so as to secure the woman an easy delivery. In primitive communities, the moon is frequently called the Lord of the Women, for the moon is regarded not only as the source of woman's ability to bear children, but also as the protector and guardian of women in all their special activities. In such tribes, the women have charge of all matters concerned with the food supply except the hunting and killing of game. It is the women who must search for wild roots and fruits and prepare them for eating. And when the tribe becomes more settled and begins some primitive agriculture, it is the women's task to take care for the fields as soon as the men have done the preliminary clearing. Planting, cultivating, and harvesting are all women's tasks, for it is generally thought that only women can make things grow, because they alone are under the direct guardianship of the moon, whose power to make things grow and increase is delegated in some measure to them. For primitive peoples consider that women must be of the same nature as the moon, not only on account of their tendency to swell up as the moon does, but also because of their monthly cycle, which is of the same duration as the moon's. The word for menstruation and the word for moon are either the same or are closely related in many languages, a fact which shows the close connection that is felt to exist between women and the moon. Her monthly cycle is of the moon, a direct evidence of her essential at-oneness with the heavenly body. The strange beliefs and customs that relate to this moon cycle and the taboos that cling to menstruation will be taken up in detail in a later chapter. Here it is sufficient to say that this correspondence between women and the moon is taken to be absolute proof of the fact that they are of like nature. These beliefs are exceedingly primitive and naive. In their original form, they seem so remote from us as to be utterly incomprehensible. They suggest a way of thinking that is quite foreign to our own mentality, with its scientific outlook and emphasis on rigid causality. Yet many of these ideas have survived today in customs, proverbs, and folkways whose significance is realized only dimly, if at all. It is difficult for us, however, to understand the rationale for these beliefs about the moon. The complete absence of any causal relation between sleeping in the moonlight and becoming pregnant makes them seem unthinkable to us. But primitive man knows nothing of what we call logic. In this case, he would argue in some such way as this: the moon, when it first appears as new moon, is small. It then grows to a round fullness. Woman is of like nature with the moon, so exposure to its influence produces a similar effect in her. If a woman with a flat stomach is exposed to the light of the young moon, her stomach will grow large and full. In fact, a sort of mimetic effect takes place. In cases where a woman does not want a child, she takes precautions against pregnancy by avoiding exposure to moonlight. Or she uses an apotropaic ritual, as the At woman does when she rubs spittle on her stomach to prevent its swelling. This is perhaps the most primitive form of contraceptive we know of. When, however, a childless woman wants a baby, she exposes herself to the light of the new moon, or makes offerings to the moon and invokes its aid. The waxing moon is patron of all things that grow or should grow. Only this word patron represents a much later idea than these we are considering, for patron would mean one who watches over or cares for the things that grow. But to the primitive, the moon is the cause of all growth and increase. It is literally the power of growth. Similar ideas are held by peoples far more advanced than the Nigerians and the Ats, only they lurk in a sort of twilight. It is half-belief, which is not looked at any too closely, perhaps for fear that the intellect would reject what the less conscious feelings cannot help but accept. The crescent moon, for instance, has been used throughout the ages as a charm to bring increase of flocks and herds and corn, and more especially increase in the family. A blessing desired, perhaps more than any other, by primitive and peasants whose only insurance against poverty and destitution in old age is the blessing of stalwart sons and daughters. All Western Asia once wore the crescent for this purpose, just as the women of southern Italy still wear it as a charm or amulet to secure the moon mother's help in childbirth. Today, the Catholic women of Italy would tell you that the mother who is moon of our church is Mother Mary, but as they say it, they will as likely as not look up to the moon in the sky and make a gesture of reverence. Among ourselves, it is felt to be lucky to see the new moon. We say to each other, "There's a new moon tonight," with a little more pleasure and sense of satisfaction than the mere fact would seem to warrant. Perhaps this is all that remains in our consciousness of the old attitude, or perhaps we amusedly go through the old ritual, look at the moon over the left shoulder, curtsy, take out money and turn it over, for the moon, the increaser, will multiply it for us, and so go without looking back. These are simple folk rituals and seemingly silly, but they are all to be found in the worship of Hecate, the Greek moon goddess, where they are parts of elaborate ceremonials. The growing phase of the moon, its waxing, represented to all these primitive peoples the generative aspect of the heavenly power. But this period of increase in strength is short-lived. The power of the moon is soon spent and a period of decrease follows. The moon gradually wanes and finally disappears entirely, and the nights are again dark. Primitives felt very differently about this second half of the moon month. They thought that the moon was being overcome, eaten up by a dark and destructive power. The waning moon thus represented to them the powers of destruction and of death. Under the waning moon, it is said that all things are diminished and brought low. The time of the waning moon, by a natural deduction, was considered unlucky for any enterprise, such as sowing grain that needed growth. When there was no moon, or as we should say, in the dark of the moon, the destructive powers were at their height. Floods and storms, or destructive pests, were to be expected, and ghosts walked or flitted shrilling through the air. This was the time when the powers of sorcery and black magic could be evoked to work their mischief unchecked, for the dark moon was captain of the hordes of ghosts and mistress of black magic. These beliefs about the phases of the moon were not just formulas to the people who held them. They were accepted quite simply as having to do with matters of fact. Consequently, the everyday life of whole communities was regulated in accordance with the phases of the moon. For instance, all agricultural proceedings had to be timed with the moon's changes, and it was a matter of great importance for the public welfare that the people should know exactly when a new moon was to be expected. In the absence of calendars, it became one of the chief functions of the headman or king to keep watch for the new moon, and then to call all the people together and tell them that now is the time to sow their seed or to harvest their crops. In China, the new moon was formally proclaimed by heralds sent out by the royal astronomer. During the waxing moon, all those things that need to grow had to be attended to. This meant that the ground must be prepared ahead, so that the seed could be sown during the first quarter of the moon. Otherwise, it would rot in the ground. Sheep must be sheared under the waxing moon, so that the wool may grow again quickly. But trees must be felled under the waning moon, for the wood will not mature well. Hay and grain must be cut under the waning moon, or they will ferment and the grain will sprout. All these regulations were felt to be essential if man was to succeed in his attempts to increase the food supply of nature. He had to work with her laws, not against them, and he believed that her laws were controlled by the moon. Many superstitions related to the moon are still to be found among country people both in the British Isles and on the continent of Europe, but they are perhaps most common among the Negroes of the southern United States. On one plantation, a necklace of birth beads is still treasured. It was brought over from Africa by the slaves and has been carefully guarded ever since. It is not often that a white person is allowed a glimpse of the precious talisman, which is brought into use whenever a woman is in childbed. The roughly carved beads bear symbols of power, chief among them being the crescent moon. Another highly valued charm among the Negroes is a rabbit's foot. This charm is most powerful if the rabbit was caught in a graveyard at the full of the moon. Under these circumstances, the amulet is indeed invincible. The graveyard, of course, refers to the magic power of ghosts, but we ask, why a rabbit? The full moon gives the clue. The markings to be seen on its face are called the mark of the hare in Tibet, China, and Ceylon, as well as in Africa and North America. Indeed, the hare in the moon is as well known as our own man in the moon. The rabbit or hare represents, to the Negro as well as to the American Indian, the animal incarnation of the hero. We recall the stories of Brer Rabbit among the Negroes of the United States, which correspond exactly to myths of a rabbit hero in West Africa. In North American Indian mythology, hare plays a similar role. For instance, among the Iroquois, Great Hare is one form of Great Manitou, the Great Spirit, who is either himself the moon or his grandmother is the moon. This hare incarnation corresponds roughly to the Christian symbolism of Christ as hero, who is the lamb that was slain. The Easter Bunny contains a symbolism that lies close to these ideas. Easter, as we shall see later, was originally a moon festival and was connected with the resurrection of the moon man or moon hero long before the dawn of Christianity. When we come to discuss the beliefs of the moon religions, it will be found that these same powers and characteristics are ascribed to the moon deity and are there elaborated into a complete system. In writing about the beliefs of his own day, Plutarch wrote that the waxing moon causes growth and increase and is of good intent. It is strange to us to think of the moon as having intention, either good or bad. It implies a personification of the moon which is foreign to us. The Greeks of Plutarch's time were far from primitive, so that it is not only primitive people who can be swayed by such an idea. In the last chapter, it was shown that personifications of this kind have their origin in the unconscious. For the unrealized part of the human psyche are projected onto the outer world and give rise to myths and superstitions. In former days, as we have seen, the reproductive or creative power of the female was not recognized as such, and so was projected to the moon as representative of the feminine principle. For those early people were entirely unaware that it is part of the feminine essence to reproduce. They thought of that power as resident in the moon and only lent to females, whether of the plant or animal kingdom, on account of a certain similarity in the nature of female on earth and moon in heaven. It is helpful to realize this, for in the unconscious we still feel and act much as primitive man does.